Oh my god, that's so edgy. Oh, so much edge. Oh, that's brutal. Oh, ah, ah, ah. So, last week I booted up Steam and had a quick flick through the homepage to have a look at the recommended deals, as one does. A few clicks in and I discovered that Postal Redux was on sale for $1.99. Now, back in the days of 2001, me and my friends discovered this game's sequel, Postal 2, and had a bit of fun playing it. Mainly because of how horrible and offensive it was, and your parents wouldn't allow it. You know, this game was banned in many countries, and for a relatively short time, it was the go-to game that was warping children's minds and causing all the murders that go on in the world, and yada yada yada. Playing it more recently, though, it's an average, sort of open-world shooter set over the course of 5 days. Each day you're given a list of things to do, such as pick up your paycheck, buy milk, confess to the priest, yada yada yada. You can be as violent or as passive as you want to be in carrying out these tasks. You can wait in line at the shop to pay for your milk, or kill everyone in there and fight your way out of the shop past security. But along your way, things will happen that will put your life in danger. For example, on the first day, you go and pick up your paycheck from work, which happens to be the same game development studio that actually made the actual game in real life. Outside are protesters, angry that these people are making such violent content for games. These anti-violence video game protesters later storm the building with shotguns and assault rifles and try to massacre everybody inside. Another day has you return a book to the library, only for it to be assaulted and burnt down by anti-book extremists. Yet another day sees a church attacked by Muslim extremists, and on the following days they have covered up the church steeples with cardboard cutouts of mosque domes. What I'm getting at with this is that while some of the moment-to-moment gameplay was morally pretty horrific, what with all the civilian murder, using cats as gun silencers, bashing people's heads off with spades, and having a button dedicated to unzipping yourself, the game it was wrapped up in did not take itself seriously. It knew it was immature, over the top, and it was self-aware of what it was, which meant it never really felt too sinister or dark. It just felt a bit goofy. Its prequel, however, is somewhat different, as I've come to learn, and by somewhat I mean different in almost every possible way. Postal Redux is basically a HD touched-up version of the original, with some sound bites and effects from Postal 2 thrown in, I suppose, to appeal to people who, like myself, have only played Postal 2. It's an isometric twin-stick shooter. I call it twin-stick, but I use the mouse and keyboard, but I think twin-stick shooter is an easier way to explain the control type. You know what I mean when I say that. You start in an area with a gun and unlimited ammo, and coppers looking for you so they can kill you. No backstory, no build-up, no character development, just dropped in an area and told to kill 90% of enemies to unlock the next area. There are innocents running around, but these can be ignored. There are no points for killing civvies. You can eventually get different weapons from downed enemies, and you also get a variety of grenades and mines and such. For what it is, it's a pretty solid game. If you're a bit of a graphics whore, this will let you down. This is a touched-up game that was originally released in 1997. But you can clearly see enemies on the screen and your character's position. Health is replenished through health packs dotted around each map, which in this day and age really does show how old it is. The controls work well enough, but there was so much of a delay with throwing weapons such as grenade and molotovs that whoever you were aiming at will probably be out of the way before your character actually throws it. There's a wide enough variety of weapons, from your basic shotguns, assault rifles and revolvers, through to flamethrowers, missile launchers, and what appears to be the napalm launcher from Postal 2. The isometric view never really caused me any bother, though it was occasionally, very occasionally, difficult to tell whether you could fit between two buildings, which resulted in me running for cover which wasn't there, and ultimately getting killed. Difficulty increases as you progress through each area by providing more enemies with tougher armour, which I personally feel is a bit of a lazy way of increasing difficulty. You don't have to increase in skill, you just sort of have to get lucky with where your health packs are. Ammo can sometimes be scarce for certain weapons, which left me finding myself saving more powerful weapons, just in case I really needed a big boom a bit later on to get me out of a sticky situation. I must say, I was disappointed to find that the tone of Postal 2 was not at all present here. Granted, there is no story, and you only occasionally get a one-liner from the player character, which are sort of tongue-in-cheek in fairness, but in between each level is a loading screen with a very well drawn but also rather gruesome image with some text beneath it, presumably supposed to be the inner monologue of the postal dude himself. Stuff like, "The air ripens with the odours of the dead and dying, and blood splinters everywhere like a river flowing around me." You know, edgy, nasty stuff like that. The ending so-called cutscene, which is really just a series of images with pulsing effects over dialogue, is also intended to be visually disturbing, and I can see how it would be. This is horror violence as written by a disgruntled 15-year-old. The game took me 1 hour and 1 minute to complete, according to the footage review count thing. What was there was solid enough, but not exactly what I would call entertaining. And I don't say that from some perceived moral high ground. Senseless violence and hypergore are all very good with me. I know how to separate fiction from reality, and I do not still believe that computer games or any sort of media would be able to warp anyone's fragile little mind any more than the evening news would. The game was just repetitive, and didn't really go anywhere, and you play the opening section and that's basically the entire game, and I can't see myself ever wanting to play it again. There is a time attack mode for those who like that sort of thing, but it's just the same levels as the main game, but with a timer on it. So, after playing this game and being somewhat disappointed, I wondered why there was never a big fuss about it when it came out. Then I remembered that it came out while the internet was still in its infancy. So it was probably not accessible to anyone outside of the US at the time of release. But it did remind me of another twin-stick shooter game that had you wandering around shooting people in a mildly depraved manner that did cause a bit of an uproar on the internet. Hatred was released in June last year, and before its release it had already caused quite a stir. It was temporarily removed from Steam before accusations of censorship and denying free speech forced Steam to allow it to be sold again. On paper, it sounds very similar to Postal. It's an isometric cameraed twin-stick shooter with lots and lots of innocent civilians running around for you to shoot as you go about your objectives. Hatred, however, has a much darker tone than the already fairly dark Postal Redux. The nameless player character is basically just fed up of the world and everybody in it, so he sets out to massacre as many people as possible. He eventually decides on his wonderful little journey to blow up the local nuclear power station, thus killing everyone and everything in the surrounding area. So there's almost a story here. But the meat of the game, while on paper very similar to Postal, is different in some significant ways. For starters, and this is more of a curse of more modern games I feel, you can only carry 3 guns at a time. Certain enemies carry certain weapons, and certain enemies heavily populate certain areas, so you basically end up swapping to whatever gun is most accessible at the time and dealing with it. There are also some structure to this game, or rather in each area. Instead of just killing enough people to fill a meter, you have certain places marked on your radar to go to and just kill everyone inside. Or rather, you reach a certain point in the building, and then you unlock that area as a new respawn point for when you die. On the subject of death, in order to avoid it and refill your health, you have to perform an execution. These can only be performed on wounded enemies or civilians, and these usually involve a mini cutscene showing them being stabbed in the head, or having their throats slit, or curb stomped, or strangling them with a gun, and other similar delights. These are the parts of the initial reveal trailer which I feel caused the most controversy, as they were really rather graphic. This eventually proved to me to become a rather troublesome mechanic, as later on in the game, when armed enemies have better weapons and ammo, it was difficult to wound them instead of killing them outright. I had to keep running to a group of civilians, swap out to a weaker weapon, wound them, and then execute them before running back to the fight, which sort of broke up the flow of what the whole game is supposed to be about, running and gunning. I also had several problems with reloading. It was never made clear whether a reload had been interrupted before it had been completed or not, or even whether the character would automatically reload after emptying a clip. That seemed to be pretty random, and with a screen full of enemies, bodies, gunfire and explosions, it's difficult to see what animations are actually playing out. On that subject of looking at things, the game does look very good for what it is. Everything is in black and white except for certain things, such as blood, because you really need to see the blood in this game, I suppose, explosive barrels, which helps tactical decisions during fights, and explosions, muzzle flare, and some neon lights. It gives almost a film noir sort of unique look to the game, almost quite reminiscent of certain scenes from Sin City. The destruction physics are also worth highlighting. If you set off an explosion in a small room inside a house, the walls of the room would blow out and send chunks scattering. High-powered weapons could blow holes in walls, providing new pathways or clear a shot on incoming enemies. There's also a kick button. When you kick a door, that door flies off its hinges and splinters into several little pieces. It's actually a lot more impressive and a lot more physically involved than I thought it would be. Another thing this game does differently from Postal is that on top of all the running and gunning, you can also drive any cars that you find. This seems really pointless at first, as it doesn't take them long to explode from sustained gunfire, until later on you find armoured cars such as Humvees and SWAT vans with mounted guns on top. Again, these won't last very long under heavy fire, but it's something else added in to at least give you a bit of variety in your massacring of innocent people. The map sizes are also a lot bigger than I expected, giving you some variety in the way you approach targets. There are usually wooded areas surrounding more built-up areas for you to run around and shoot people in, as well as suburban areas. There's a train station later on, a big town square, complete with a political rally going on for you to eviscerate your way through. So after all that, so far this sounds like a more modern take on the original Postal, but there is a couple of problems which really stuck out to me with Hatred. The biggest problem is the camera. Enemies can shoot you before they're on your screen, and the camera seems to loosely float ahead of you in whatever direction you're aiming. If you're trying to avoid fire or desperately trying to wound a civilian to heal from them, this can get troublesome, and having everything black and white, while very stylistic and does look good, causes problems with navigating some areas, particularly woods or places with lots of bodies and structural destruction, which is pretty much everywhere. I think a less floaty camera, like with Postal, and even being able to rotate it, like we can with XCOM and other such games, isometric games, would have made this a much more enjoyable experience. Even, I say enjoyable, apart from all the grim executions and miserable protagonist. And about the protagonist, the dialogue is pretty terrible, both in terms of script and the delivery of said script.
This train's going to be a big iron coffin for all of you. Where are we heading? The next station is near a nuclear power plant. That gives me an idea. Looks like a good opportunity for heavy casualties among this pathetic population. Finally, my journey has a target. But first, I'm gonna cleanse this place of these fucking worthless maggots.
This game also has a similar issue to Postal, in that to increase the difficulty, they just increase the number of heavily armed and armoured enemies to throw at you. And before I said that I think that's lazy, to me it just doesn't cut it. Postal could get away with it because it was older. This is a more modern game. This has had a chance to learn. This just doesn't cut it anymore. Increased difficulty should be achieved by making things more challenging in a way that makes you pay attention to what you're doing, learning from your mistakes and everything you've learned up to that point, combining tactics you've already used to overcome an adversary. Basically, what Dark Souls does. But throwing a higher number of tougher enemies at you just seems lazy. It may not be so bad if the core game itself was entertaining, but it's just not, really. I found myself having to run around looking for civilians to kill just to fill a quota for some areas, just to unlock the next area. Like with No Russian from Modern Warfare 2, killing someone who isn't fighting back isn't a challenge, it isn't fun, and it's not really how I want to be spending my time. Again, that's not me trying to say this game is evil or morally bad or it's going to corrupt children or whatever, but killing things that don't fight back is usually reserved for tutorial levels and not scattered throughout an entire game. So, in conclusion, if you're in the market for a twin-stick isometric shooter that lets you gun down innocents, kill police and take on the army, and you don't want to spend more than £10, don't bother. Like a prostitute for a similar amount of money, it won't be exciting, it'll be over too quickly while simultaneously feeling like it's gone on for too long, and you'll feel a bit uneasy about yourself afterwards. But if you're really hard up and really need one of these games, I'd suggest Postal Redux over Hatred. Or, save up your money and get GTA, where you can kill innocents, police, army, gangsters, Italians, Mexicans, Chinese, and even wild animals, and it's all in a game that's actually good. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for sticking with me through this exploration of horrific twin-stick isometric shooters. Thank you very much for watching. Any likes, subscribes, comments, abuse, or any sort of interaction at all is greatly appreciated. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.